Courtship by the rules, love in a world of chaperones * Eleanor. Whitmore had been raised to believe that a young lady's reputation was the most fragile possession she owned, more delicate than lace, more breakable than crystal. At 17, she already understood that every step she took, every word she uttered, and every glance she exchanged existed under the careful supervision of someone older, wiser, and infinitely more watchful. In her case, that watchful presence was Aunt Josephine, the self-appointed guardian of propriety who seemed to materialize. In every doorway at precisely the wrong moment, it was early spring when Eleanor first saw him, Jonathan Harrow, standing near the wrought iron gate that bordered the Whitmore estate. The air smelled of lilacs, and a pale breeze drifting from the river rustled the ribbons of her hat. She had been returning from her morning walk, escorted as always by Aunt Josephine, whose pace was brisk and whose eyes never strayed from Eleanor for long. Jonathan, dressed in a tailored coat that suggested both wealth and excellent taste, tipped his hat politely as they passed. His smile was brief but startlingly genuine, something rare in a world where everyone seemed to smile only out of obligation. Aunt Josephine had not missed the exchange. "Do not dawdle, Eleanor," she snapped. "There is nothing to be gained from interacting with young men we do not know." Eleanor kept her eyes downcast, though her heart felt suddenly light. She had seen that look in Jonathan's eyes, a look not of mere politeness, but unmistakable interest. The Whitmore family belonged to that comfortable middle rung of society, respected, reasonably wealthy, but still striving for a place among those whose names were printed regularly in the society pages. For them, every social interaction was part of a delicate dance, a step toward greater recognition. Aunt Josephine, determined to guide Eleanor into the perfect match, saw danger in any unexpected encounter. Jonathan Harrow, however, was anything but unexpected. By the following afternoon, a calling card arrived at the Whitmore residence. It was hand-delivered by a footman wearing the dark blue livery of the Harrow household, an unmistakable signal of prestige. Aunt Josephine read the card twice, her eyebrows climbing with interest. "Mr. Jonathan Harrow requests the honor of calling upon us," she murmured. "It seems he is the nephew of Sir Edward Harrow." That changed everything. Within the rigid structure of Victorian courtship, a young man could not simply stroll up to a woman and introduce himself. He needed permission first from her family, then from her chaperone, and finally from the world at large. Jonathan had followed every rule perfectly, and Aunt Josephine, who believed deeply in rules, was suddenly enthusiastic. When Jonathan arrived the next afternoon, Eleanor discovered that the mysterious young man by the gate was even more striking up close. He had thoughtful gray eyes and a manner both confident and warm. Yet every moment of their conversation unfolded under the unyielding eyes of Aunt Josephine. Seated only a few feet away with her sewing basket, pretending to mend lace while missing nothing, "Miss Whitmore," Jonathan said, offering a polite bow, "I hope the spring has treated you kindly. I often see you walking with your aunt. It is a fine neighborhood for such pastimes." Eleanor smiled demurely. "The weather has been pleasant, sir. And yes, my aunt and I walk most mornings." Aunt Josephine cleared her throat loudly, as if reminding them that she was fully present. Jonathan did not falter. "I wondered," he said, choosing his words with care, "whether your aunt might permit you to join my sister and me at the Botanical Gardens next Thursday. The magnolias are in bloom, and my sister is quite fond of their fragrance." Aunt Josephine set down her needlework. "A respectable outing, accompanied by your sister?" she asked. "I suppose that may be arranged," and so it was. The Botanical Gardens were abuzz with life, that Thursday couples strolling under archways of wisteria, families pausing by fountains, and children playing along gravel pathways. Eleanor felt a flutter of excitement the entire time, though she kept her hands neatly folded as a proper lady should. Jonathan's sister, Margaret, proved delightful company, chatty, warm, and clearly invested in her brother's happiness. She walked a few steps ahead with Aunt Josephine, giving Jonathan the opportunity he needed. Not unsupervised, of course, never that, but close enough. "Do you enjoy gardening, Miss Whitmore?" Jonathan asked. "I enjoy anything outdoors," she replied, her voice soft but confident. "It is the one place where one feels free." "Free," he repeated thoughtfully. A rare feeling indeed. They paused near a small pond where sunlight glimmered across the water. Ducks glided gently across the surface, their ripples scattering light. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. I hope I am not overstepping. But I would very much like to continue our acquaintance properly. Of course, Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. I would like that as well, she said, careful not to sound overly eager. That evening, after Eleanor retired to her room, Aunt Josephine lingered at the doorway. He seems a good man, she said, her tone unexpectedly soft. But remember, Eleanor's courtship is not merely romance. It is a path toward security, stability. Choose wisely, even if your heart becomes involved. Eleanor nodded, though her heart had already made its choice. The following weeks were a blur of polite visits, chaperoned outings, and exchanged letters that carried more emotion than propriety allowed. Eleanor learned that Jonathan was a businessman with interests in shipping, ambitious and determined to create something meaningful rather than rely on his family's wealth. He confided carefully, always carefully, that he admired her independence, her curiosity about the world, and her quiet courage. Their affection grew in that restrained, careful way unique to the Victorian era where even the slightest brush of fingertips could feel like an electric confession. One warm afternoon, during a tea hosted by the Whitmore family, Jonathan asked to speak with Eleanor on the veranda. Aunt Josephine agreed, positioning herself near the doorway where she could still observe. Jonathan's voice was gentle but steady, Miss Whitmore. I wish to ask your permission to speak with your father. I wish to request your hand. The words, though expected, sent a rush of emotion through Eleanor. Her fingers trembled slightly against the rail. Mr. Harrow, she replied, you honor me. Her heart soared, but then a shadow crossed her thoughts. She looked toward Aunt Josephine, who watched them with sharp eyes. Victorian rules loomed. Heavy marriage meant more than love. It meant duty. It meant stepping into a new world dictated by her husband's choices. Was she ready? Jonathan sensed her hesitation. I do not ask this lightly, he said. Nor do I expect you to surrender your dreams. I want a partner, Eleanor, at a possession, she exhaled. A breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then yes, she whispered. Yes, you may speak to my father. The formalities proceeded quickly, as they always did when families approved of a match. Mr. Whitmore welcomed Jonathan's proposal warmly. His connections, ambition, and reputation made him an ideal choice. Aunt Josephine's satisfaction was unmistakable. Though she still maintained her practiced air of neutrality, the engagement announcement appeared in the local papers the following week. Eleanor felt a mixture of exhilaration and fear and acknowledgement that life as she knew it was changing irrevocably. One evening, days before the wedding, Jonathan and Eleanor were permitted a brief walk in the garden, still chaperoned, but with enough distance to speak freely. I hope you know, Jonathan said quietly, that I intend to honor every promise I have made. Eleanor took his arm lightly. And I hope you know, she replied, that despite the rules that have shaped us, I choose you freely. The twilight air shimmered with fireflies, tiny sparks drifting through the shadows. For a moment, despite all the constraints, they felt truly alone when their hands brushed. Eleanor did not pull away. It was a small rebellion, a tiny defiance of an era. It's built on restraint. But it was enough. Their wedding was held in early summer, an elegant ceremony attended by family, friends, and far too many curious onlookers. Eleanor walked down the aisle wearing lace Aunt Josephine had meticulously mended. Feeling the weight of 100 expectations and the freedom of one powerful truth, she loved Jonathan. And he loved her, as the vows were spoken, as the choir sang, and as the future unfurled before her like a long garden path. Eleanor realized something profound. Courtship may have required chaperones' rules, and endless caution, but love once found belonged entirely to the two who shared it. And that, she thought, as Jonathan took her hand, was something no rule could ever restrain. Letters, calling cards, and the art of saying everything without saying much. The morning sun slanted through the lace curtains of the Whitmore parlor, scattering pale gold across Eleanor's writing desk. It had been nearly 3 months since her engagement to Jonathan Harrow, and though propriety demanded restraint until the wedding day, the exchange of letters between them had become a tender ritual, one that allowed their hearts to speak more freely than their lips ever could under the watchful eyes of society. Eleanor held the latest envelope carefully, as if it were made of delicate porcelain. Jonathan's handwriting, precise, elegant, unmistakably, has traced her name across the front. She did not open it immediately. That would be too bold, too eager. Instead, she allowed her fingers to rest on the warm paper, savoring the anticipation. Another letter from Mr. Harrow? Aunt Josephine called from behind, her voice tinged with mild suspicion. Eleanor straightened. Yes, Aunt. He wished to inform me about the arrangements for next week's luncheon. Aunt Josephine adjusted her spectacles. I hope he doesn't reveal too much in those letters. A man should not bare his soul before the wedding. Is that not what vows are for? Eleanor smiled softly. I assure you, Aunt Josephine, Jonathan writes with impeccable propriety. It was true. Jonathan's letters were models of Victorian delicacy. Every phrase was carefully chosen, each sentence polished to a gentleman's shine. Yet between the understated lines, beneath the respectful tone, Eleanor had learned to read the deeper meanings, the warmth of affection, the flicker of longing, and the quiet dreams he rarely voiced aloud. She carried the letter to her window seat, and finally broke the seal. My dearest Miss Whitmore, it began, I trust the morning finds you well. The days feel infinitely longer when I do not catch a glimpse of you. Though I know we must abide by the distance that propriety requires. Eleanor's heart fluttered. Jonathan had mastered the art of saying everything without saying too much, just as she had. Before Jonathan, Eleanor had rarely given thought to the language of calling cards, a world of coded gestures, folded corners, and delicate paper rectangles that held extraordinary power. But now it was her daily reality. Every week brought dozens of cards from acquaintances, distant relatives, and curious society mothers who hoped to secure an invitation to the wedding. Her silver card tray overflowed, each tiny rectangle a silent statement. But none carried the weight of Jonathan's. She still remembered the first, the time she held his card. It had been crisp, elegant, embossed with his initials, and bordered with a subtle, tasteful design. A gentleman's card, confident but not ostentatious. Aunt Josephine had inspected it closely, as though it might reveal hidden secrets about his character. A very fine card, her aunt had said approvingly. Strong paper, clean lines. The young man has good taste. Eleanor had wanted to say that she already knew this, that she had seen it. Ain't the way Jonathan carried himself, the way he spoke to her, the way he regarded the world with both ambition and humility. But she said nothing. Victorian decorum demanded silence far more often than speech. Each week, Jonathan left his card at the Whitmore house, a gesture that seemed simple but held profound meaning. It signified interest, respect, and commitment, all without a single spoken word. Eleanor treasured them, storing each card in a small carved box beneath her bed. It was childish, perhaps, but the cards felt like tiny fragments of Jonathan himself. Aunt Josephine, however, kept a strict eye on these exchanges. She knew too well that even the smallest actions could fuel gossip. If Jonathan arrived too often, it suggested impropriety. If he arrived too seldom, it signaled disinterest. Everything had to be balanced with perfect precision. One afternoon, as Eleanor prepared to write her reply to Jonathan's letter, Aunt Josephine entered the parlor with her usual briskness. Your handwriting has improved, I see, she observed dryly. I suppose love inspires neat pen shit. Eleanor flushed lightly. If my letters are neater, Aunt, it is only because I wish to be clear. Clear, Aunt, Josephine repeated. In my youth, we were taught to write so vaguely that a man could never be entirely certain whether we adored him or merely tolerated him. I prefer certainty, Eleanor said. That, her aunt muttered, is your father's influence? Men are far too obsessed with clarity. Despite her sharp words, Aunt Josephine smiled faintly as she left the room, something she rarely did. Her stern exterior often hid the tenderness beneath. The next major event in their courtship came in the form of an invitation, cream-colored card edged with gold filigree. Delivered by Jonathan's sister Margaret. Eleanor opened it carefully, while Margaret waited with barely suppressed excitement. "A piano soirée?" Eleanor said, reading the elegant script. "Yes." Margaret beamed. "My brother insisted on hosting one before the wedding. Music brings out emotion, and emotion, when properly controlled, can be quite charming." Eleanor laughed. "Then I look forward to it." Margaret's eyes sparkled. "Jonathan has been practicing a piece specifically for the occasion." Eleanor blinked. "He plays?" "Oh, yes," Margaret whispered conspiratorially. "Not as well as he manages a business deal, but well enough to impress someone he cares for." Eleanor felt the warmth rise to her cheeks again. The evening of the soirée arrived with the crisp scent of autumn in the air. The Harrow estate, grand without being gaudy, glowed under rows of carefully placed candles. Calling cards were collected at the door by 2 footmen, marking the presence of each guest. When Eleanor entered the music room, Aunt Josephine at her side. Of course, Jonathan turned toward her instantly. His expression, though composed, carried a quiet joy that needed no words. "Miss Whitmore," he said with a bow, "you honor us with your presence, and you with your invitation," Alina replied. The evening unfolded with the gentle hum of conversation, the clink of teacups, and the graceful notes of Chopin and Beethoven drifting through the room. Eleanor listened politely to each performer, but her attention drifted toward Jonathan as he waited for his turn at the piano. When he finally sat before the keys, a hush fell. The first notes were soft, uncertain, almost shy. But as the melody grew, Jonathan's confidence blossomed. It was not a grand performance meant to awe the crowd. It was intimate, tender, impossibly sincere. Eleanor understood every unspoken word in that music. When the piece ended, the applause was gentle but warm. Jonathan's eyes met hers across the room with a message clear as any letter. This was for you. After the soirée, a new ritual emerged in their courtship musical notes tucked inside letters, tiny sketches along the margins, and occasional poems so subtle that only Eleanor could decipher their meaning. One afternoon, Eleanor received a letter unlike any other. There were no flourishes, no practiced politeness, only a single line written in Jonathan's steady hand. "I miss speaking freely with you." It was improper, bold, almost reckless. Eleanor pressed the letter to her chest. Later that evening, she wrote her reply with trembling hands. "One day soon, we will not need letters to speak truth." She sealed it quickly, praying Aunt Josephine would not insist on reading it first. Yet not all communication flowed smoothly. Rumors began to circulate regarding Jonathan's business ventures, whispers of risk, speculation, and ambition exceeding prudence. At tea one afternoon, Eleanor overheard 2 society women discussing it with morbid delight. "They say he invested in a shipping company that lost half its cargo last season," one whispered, "and that he intends to buy a fleet outright," the other exclaimed. Such boldness does not always pay off. Eleanor felt a cold tingle of fear. Her family valued stability above all, and any hint of financial recklessness was cause for concern. That evening, when Jonathan's calling card arrived as usual, Eleanor hesitated before sending her own in return. She needed answers, but asking directly would seem unladylike, intrusive, even unfeminine. Victorian expectations weighed heavily upon her ink-stained fingers. Instead, she crafted a letter with careful diplomacy. "I hear the world of business can be unpredictable. I hope you are not troubled by recent events." It was gentle, vague, yet Jonathan would understand. His response arrived the next morning. "There is truth in the rumors, but not danger. I take risks only where I see promise. I would never jeopardize the future we are soon to share." Eleanor exhaled in relief. Beneath the refined constraints of their correspondence, found a way to speak honestly, something rare and precious. Winter crept toward the city. With crisp winds and early twilights, Eleanor and Jonathan's wedding lay only weeks away. Their letters grew longer, more intimate, filled with quiet hopes and restrained affection. They still avoided explicit declarations, Of course, such things belonged to honeymooners, not engaged couples in a house full of chaperones. But their words held promise. One snowy afternoon, Jonathan visited the Whitmore house with a calling card that bore a small, handwritten addition. A single word: soon Eleanor felt her heartbeat quicken. It was the boldest message he had ever sent. Later that evening, as she sorted through the old calling cards in her carved wooden box, Eleanor realized how each delicate slip of paper had carried them closer from strangers to acquaintances. From acquaintances to lovers, from lovers to partners, about to embark on a shared future. Victorian society prized subtlety above passion. Yet within these quiet exchanges, letters, calling cards, stolen phrases in the margins, they had built something strong, enduring, and deeply heartfelt. When Eleanor wrote her final letter before the wedding, she allowed herself one moment of bravery. I look forward to a time when we may speak without restraint, when every thought need not be hidden between lines. Until then, know that every word you write is cherished. Jonathan's response came swiftly. The day approaches, my dearest Eleanor, when we shall no longer depend on ink and paper to say what is already written in our hearts. For once, nothing more needed to be said. Marriage as destiny, romance, duty. And the social ladder, the morning of Eleanor Whitmore's wedding, dawned with soft gray skies, the kind that seemed to wrap the world in a hushed expectation. Servants bustled through the corridors of the Whitmore residence, carrying ribbons, flowers, linens, and all the delicate fineries required for the most important day of a Victorian woman's life. For months, Eleanor had imagined this day through a haze of nervous excitement. Now that it had arrived, she felt suspended between joy and fear, between the life she was leaving and the one she was about to enter. Marriage was not merely a personal choice in Victorian society. It was a culmination of destiny, duty, and family ambition. And for the Whitmores, Eleanor's marriage to Jonathan Harrow symbolized everything they hoped for as security, respectability, and a step upward on the ever-watchful social ladder. Aunt Josephine, of course, had been awake since dawn, already dressed in her finest gray silk. She hovered outside Eleanor's dressing room with the urgency of a general preparing for battle. Stand straight, dear, she said, adjusting Eleanor's veil. Remember that propriety is everything today. The entire Harrow family will be watching. Eleanor met her aunt's eyes in the mirror. I know, you are marrying into a family with influence, Aunt Josephine continued. Your conduct must reflect the honor of both households. Eleanor nodded, though a quiet rebellion stirred within her. She wasn't marrying for influence. She wasn't marrying because society demanded it, or because her father sought advancement. She was marrying Jonathan. That truth alone steadied her. Hart, the Harrow estate, had been transformed into a dream of ivory roses and polished silver. Guests filled the pews of the chapel, whispering in tones that blended admiration with speculation. Rumors of Jonathan's business ambitions had spread despite efforts to quiet them, and many wondered privately whether Eleanor understood the risks she was tying herself to. But when Jonathan entered the chapel tall, composed, his gray eyes soft with emotion, those whispers evaporated into admiration. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who intended to build a future, not inherit one. And Eleanor loved him for that, as the music swelled. Eleanor stepped through the doorway, her hand resting lightly on her father's arm. She felt the weight of 100 gazes, each one measuring her gown, her poise, her worthiness. Yet the moment her eyes met Jonathan's, the rest of the world blurred into insignificance. He smiled, not the careful, polite smile he offered society, but a real one. Warm and unguarded. The ceremony passed in a graceful haze, vows spoken, rings exchanged, blessings murmured. Eleanor felt a quiet thrill as Jonathan's hand closed over hers, steady and certain. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, a soft sigh rippled through the crowd. It was done. The Whitmore family had secured their place among the city's respected households. The Harrows had welcomed a suitable bride into their lineage, yet beneath all the formality, all the societal maneuvering, there existed the simple truth. Eleanor and Jonathan were in love, and that made the destiny they stepped into feel uniquely their own. The wedding breakfast was held in the Harrow Ballroom, where sunlight glittered off crystal chandeliers and long tables overflowed with pastries, smoked fish, and sugared fruits. Eleanor found herself moving from one conversation to another, offering polite greetings to relatives she barely knew and thanking acquaintances for compliments she hardly heard. Jonathan stayed close, always a step away, always watching her with the kind of protective awareness that made her feel centered amid the whirlwind. "Are you overwhelmed?" he asked when they found a moment alone near the balcony doors. "Only a little," she admitted. "Do you think they approve of me?" Jonathan chuckled softly. "My dear Eleanor, you could charm a room filled with marble statues." She laughed, the sound soft and surprised. "Your mother has been watching me closely." "She watches everyone closely," he corrected gently. "She respects strength. And she already respects you." Eleanor's breath eased. She had feared Madame Harrow's scrutiny the most, the elegant matriarch whose approval could define her place in the Harrow family. Yet beneath the sharp eyes, Eleanor sensed a kind of quiet warmth. Perhaps it would grow in time. "The wedding gifts are arriving," Jonathan said, nodding toward a towering display of wrapped parcels. "I believe the Whitmore silver tea set has already caused quite a stir." Eleanor rolled her eyes, amused. "My mother insisted on it. She said a proper household must begin with proper silver." "And I say," Jonathan replied, lowering his voice, "that a proper household begins with understanding." Her heart fluttered, even now, surrounded by expectation and etiquette. They managed to speak their own private language, a language that hinted at dreams, partnership, and the hope of building something more meaningful than social standing. Later in the afternoon, as Eleanor wandered briefly into the gardens to catch her breath, she encountered Jonathan's younger cousin, Clara, a bright, slightly mischievous girl of 15. "You look beautiful, Mrs. Harrow," Clara said with enthusiasm. Eleanor smiled at the new title. "Thank you, Clara. You're very kind." Clara looked around conspiratorially. "May I tell you a secret?" "If you wish. Most people marry because it is expected," Clara whispered. "But you and Jonathan, everyone can see it. You married because you chose each other." Eleanor felt her eyes warm. "I hope that remains true," Clara grinned. It was a simple exchange, but it settled warmly in Eleanor's heart. Sometimes it took a child to speak the truths adults were too polite or too cautious to say aloud. That evening, after the last guest had departed and the household quieted, Eleanor and Jonathan retreated to the smaller, private sitting room adjoining their new chambers. A single lamp glowed on the mantel, casting soft amber light that danced along the walls. Jonathan removed his formal jacket, setting it neatly aside, then turned to face her. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. "Tired," she admitted, happy and a little frightened. He stepped closer. "Of what?" She hesitated, her hands brushing along the beaded trim of her gown. "Of not being enough. Of failing to meet expectations. Of losing myself to the demands of a household that expects so much from its mistress." Jonathan reached for her hands, warm and steady. "Eleanor, listen to me. I did not marry you to fit into society's mold. I married you because you possess a strength and kindness I have never found elsewhere. Whatever expectations others may place on us on you, we will navigate them together." His words washed over her like calm water. "Together," she repeated softly, "always." For the first time that day, Eleanor allowed herself to relax fully, letting the weight of the future settle into something manageable, something shared. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor discovered that marriage in Victorian society was a complex blend of personal devotion and public duty. She was expected to manage household staff, oversee expenditures, host dinners, and maintain relationships with the families whose approval mattered most. It was exhausting, but also unexpectedly empowering. She found she possessed a natural talent for organization, diplomacy, and creating an atmosphere where guests felt welcome. Even Madame Harrow admitted grudgingly at first, then with genuine admiration that Eleanor had elevated the household's reputation, but Eleanor did not lose herself. Jonathan made sure of that. Every evening. They shared a quiet hour together sometimes, talking about the day. Sometimes simply sitting in companionable silence. He consulted her on business decisions, valuing her insight. He listened when she advocated for charitable work and supported her in founding a small reading society for women in their district. Together, they built a marriage that was neither a societal performance nor an obligation. It was a partnership, a destiny shaped not by tradition alone, but by choice. One spring afternoon, as Eleanor sat on the veranda overlooking the blooming garden, Jonathan approached her with a familiar glint in his eye. "Our life is beginning to look quite different from what society expects," he remarked. Eleanor smiled. "Does that trouble you?" "Not in the slightest," he said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "We are rising on the social ladder, yes, but on our own terms." She took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Marriage may be destiny," she said softly, "but destiny means nothing without love." Jonathan's eyes warmed. "And duty means nothing without freedom." Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, watching the sunlight drift across the garden, her garden now, her home. Her life, a life she had stepped into with courage and hope, a life chosen, cherished, and shared. And in that moment, she knew marriage was more than a societal expectation. It was the beginning of a story they would write together, one quiet decision, one gentle promise, one brave step at a time.